23 years. That is how long Hester Calloway has knelt in this same patch of English soil, planting lavender for a son who has never once come home to see it bloom. 23 springs of waiting, 23 years of watching the post office door for a letter that refused to come, and through every one of them, she never stopped planting. Tonight, we travel to a quiet village built around a stone footbridge, lit only by gas lamps and the low orange glow of fire through old glass windows, to learn why a woman would keep a promise to someone who may have long since forgotten her. This is the story of the lavender gardener of Hollow Bridge, and tonight, let it carry you somewhere far from here, to a place where waiting has become its own kind of devotion, and where the truth, when it finally arrives, comes wrapped in 23 years of silence. Long before this story begins, Hollow Bridge was already an old place, its stone bridge worn smooth by generations of boots and cart wheels, its lanes lit only after dusk by lamps that hissed and flickered against the damp evening air. It was in this village, in a small cottage at the edge of the lavender field, that Hester first learned to wait. She would tell you, if you asked her, that waiting was not so different from gardening. Both required a patience most people no longer had the heart for. Both rewarded only those willing to return, season after season, to soil that gave nothing back for a very long time. But what Hester did not yet know, on the evening this story begins, was that her waiting was about to end in a way she never could have imagined. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Hollow Bridge sat in a fold of the English countryside where the fog rarely lifted before mid-morning. And even then, it lingered along the low fields like something unwilling to leave. The village took its name from the old stone bridge at its center, worn pale by centuries of cart wheels and boots, beneath which a narrow stream ran cold and clear all year round. Past the bridge, past the bakery and the chapel and the row of cottages with their crooked chimneys, the lane climbed gently toward the lavender field, where Hester Calloway's small stone cottage had stood for as long as anyone in the village could remember. At dusk, when the gas lamps were lit one by one along the high street, the whole village seemed to settle into itself, as though it too were preparing for sleep. Hester was 61 years old, though the villagers often said she carried herself like someone older and someone younger, depending on the hour. In the mornings, with her sleeves rolled and her hands deep in the soil, she moved with a steadiness that made her seem ageless. By evening, sitting alone at her small kitchen table with the lamp turned low, something in her face suggested a woman carrying far more years than her body let on. She kept to a simple rhythm. She rose early, she tended her rows of lavender, and she walked into the village only when she needed bread or thread, never staying long enough for conversation to turn toward questions she did not wish to answer. The one person Hester never turned away was Albert Finch, the village postman, who had known her since they were both children chasing geese along the riverbank. Albert was a gentle, unhurried man, the kind who remembered everyone's birthday and never once raised his voice, even at the dogs that nipped at his bicycle wheels on his rounds. Each morning, he rode the same worn path up to Hester's cottage, and each morning, for longer than he cared to count, he had handed her nothing at all. It had become a quiet ritual between them, one neither spoke of directly. He would slow his bicycle at her gate, meet her eyes, and give the smallest shake of his head. She would nod, as though she had expected nothing else, and return to her rows of lavender without a word. It was this ritual, more than anything, that had become a quiet curiosity among the villagers of Hollow Bridge. They wondered, in the way small villages wonder about the people they cannot quite explain, why a woman with no buyer for her flowers, no shop to sell them through, and no family left to share them with, would go on planting lavender every single spring as though her life depended on it. Some said it was grief that kept her hands busy. Others said it was stubbornness, the kind that refuses to admit a thing is over simply because it has gone on too long without proof otherwise. None of them asked Hester directly, and Hester never offered an answer, though anyone who watched closely might have noticed that she always planted a few rows more than the year before, as though preparing for someone's return. What the village did know, in fragments and whispers passed between neighbors over garden walls, was that Hester had once had a son. Edward Calloway had left Hollow Bridge as a young man, full of the kind of restlessness that small villages rarely satisfy, and for some years afterward, his letters had arrived faithfully, full of news from distant places. And then, without warning or explanation, they had simply stopped. No quarrel was ever spoken of. No falling out was ever confirmed. The letters had simply ceased, the way a stream might run dry without anyone noticing the exact day the water stopped flowing. And Hester had never once spoken his name aloud in the village since. There was one more thing the villagers had long noticed but never understood. Tucked at the far edge of Hester's lavender field behind a tangle of overgrown hedge, an old glass greenhouse stood there, its panes fogged with age, its door bound shut with a heavy iron lock that Hester alone carried the key to. No one had been inside it in years. No one, save Hester, knew what it held, or why a woman who shared so little of her life would guard one small, forgotten building so carefully. It was perhaps the smallest mystery of the three. But in a village where so little ever changed, even the smallest locked door was enough to make people wonder. Hester had not always tended the lavender field alone. She had come to Hollow Bridge as a young bride, married to a quiet stonemason named Thomas Calloway, who had built the very cottage where she still lived, stone by stone, with his own 2 hands. Thomas had planted the first rows of lavender himself, in the year Edward was born, saying that a child ought to grow up surrounded by something gentle. He died only 6 years later, of a fever that swept through the village one harsh winter, leaving Hester to raise their son alone among the rows he had planted. She never spoke much of those early years of grief, but the villagers remembered them well. The way a young widow had simply kept going, kept planting, kept her small cottage warm with firelight long after most would have given up the effort. Edward grew up with dirt permanently beneath his fingernails and the scent of lavender woven into nearly every memory of his childhood. He would follow his mother through the rows each morning before school, asking questions in the relentless way that small children do, about why the bees came in such numbers, why the flowers turned blue in some light and violet in others, why his mother always planted a few extra rows at the far end of the field. Hester answered what she could and smiled through the rest, content simply to have him beside her. His small boots leaving prints in the soft earth, his laughter carrying across the field on quiet mornings when the fog had not yet lifted. In the evenings, mother and son would sit close together by the fire, Hester mending wool by lamplight while Edward read aloud from whatever book Albert Finch had managed to bring up from the village that week. Albert had become something like family in those years, the one steady presence who never failed to visit, who brought Edward stories of distant places folded inside the newspapers he delivered, who sat with Hester long after his rounds were finished simply because neither of them wished to be alone with their thoughts. It was Albert who first noticed, before Hester herself seemed to, the particular look that crossed Edward's face whenever those stories of distant places were read aloud. A look of longing far too large for so small a village to hold. By the time Edward turned 18, that longing had only grown, and Hester watched her son begin to drift toward the edges of every conversation about the wider world, the way a plant turns its leaves toward whatever light it can find. He spoke often of the cities he had read about, of ships and railways and places whose names he pronounced carefully, as though practicing for a life he had not yet earned the right to live. Hester never discouraged him, though something in her chest tightened each time he spoke this way. She had buried a husband already to circumstances beyond her control. She did not wish to bury a son's spirit to circumstances entirely within hers. It was on a quiet evening in late autumn, the lavender long since cut and dried for the season, that Edward finally told her he intended to leave. He did not raise his voice, and neither did she. They sat together by the fire as they always had, and when he finished speaking, Hester simply nodded, the way she would later nod at Albert's bicycle gate for 23 empty mornings to come. But before he left the room that night, she noticed something she would turn over in her mind for years afterward, a brief hesitation in her son's eyes, as though there were something more he wished to say and had decided, for reasons of his own, to leave unspoken. The next morning, before Edward set off down the lane with little more than a single travel case, the two of them walked together to the old glass greenhouse at the edge of the field, the same greenhouse that would later puzzle the entire village for decades to come. It had been Thomas's final project before he died, built to shelter the most delicate of Hester's lavender starts through the harshest months of winter, and it had become, over the years, a quiet meeting place between mother and son whenever words felt too heavy for the open air. Edward unlocked it that morning with the small brass key his father had given him as a boy, and what passed between them inside those fogged glass walls, Hester never once repeated to another living soul. When Edward finally walked across the stone bridge and out of Hollow Bridge for the last time anyone there would see him for many years, Hester did not weep, at least not where anyone could see. She returned instead to her rows of lavender, knelt in the cool morning soil, and began, quite calmly, to plant several rows more than she ever had before. It was the first sign, though no one yet understood it, of the promise she intended to keep for as long as it took her son to come home and see it kept. The years that followed Edward's departure moved in Hollow Bridge the way they move in every small village, slowly in the moment and swiftly in hindsight, until 23 of them had quietly stacked themselves behind Hester without her ever quite agreeing to let them pass. She kept her rhythm through all of it. She rose early. She tended her rows, and each morning, Albert Finch rode his bicycle up the lane and gave her the same small shake of his head he had given her for over 2 decades. Hester had long since stopped expecting anything different. She told herself, on the mornings she allowed herself to think about it at all, that she had made her peace with an ending that never properly arrived. Not every one of those 23 years passed in quite the same unremarkable way. There were years Hester remembered more clearly than others, years that stood apart in her memory the way certain stones stand apart along a worn path, smoother or rougher than the rest, marking something the ordinary passage of time alone could not quite explain away. There was the year, not long after Edward first left, when a storm of unusual violence tore through Hollow Bridge in the depths of winter, ripping slates from half the cottages along the high street and toppling the old oak that had stood beside the chapel for longer than anyone could remember. Hester's own roof had come through the worst of it, cracked and leaking, and it was Albert, arriving the next morning not on his bicycle but on foot through the snow, who had organized half the village to climb up with fresh slate and patch what the storm had broken. There was the year a traveling photographer passed through Hollow Bridge, offering for a single penny to capture anyone who wished it in a small tin portrait to keep. Half the village sat for him eventually, but Hester never once joined the queue, no matter how many times the photographer returned in later years on his slow circuit through the countryside. She could not have explained it fully even to herself, only that something in her refused to be captured and kept in a single fixed moment while the one person she most wished beside her in that moment remained somewhere she could not picture at all. There was the year the old chapel bell finally cracked beyond repair, its evening toll falling suddenly silent after generations of marking the hours for every soul in Hollow Bridge. Hester thought of that silent bell often in the years that followed, recognizing in it something of her own particular ache, the way an absence only reveals the true shape and weight of what it once held once it has gone quiet. There was the year Mrs. Whitcomb lost her husband, and Hester found herself spending several quiet evenings simply sitting with her, saying very little, offering only her presence in the particular way one widow can offer comfort to another. It was, perhaps, the beginning of whatever softness later passed between them. There was the year an unusually wet spring rotted nearly a third of the lavender crop, and Hester came closer than she ever admitted to simply letting the whole field go fallow that year. It was Albert, finding her standing motionless among the ruined rows, who said only that he intended to keep riding up that lane every single morning regardless of what either of them found waiting at the gate, and that he assumed she intended to keep planting regardless of what the soil gave back. She planted that year after all, smaller rows, fewer of them, but rows nonetheless, and told herself it was simply stubbornness, though she suspected even then it was something closer to faith. There was, too, the year a quiet widower named Samuel Birch, who kept the village's small smithy, began calling on Hester with a steadiness that the village noticed long before she did. Hester told him gently, after several careful weeks of consideration, that her heart remained too full of waiting to make proper room for anything else just yet. Samuel had taken the answer with quiet grace, continuing to nod to her warmly whenever their paths crossed for years afterward. There was the year a sailor passing briefly through Hollow Bridge mentioned, at the village inn, that he believed he had once crossed paths with a young carpenter's apprentice named Calloway working the southern shipping routes. The news reached Hester within a single afternoon, and for several trembling days she allowed herself something close to certainty that her son was alive and simply delayed in writing. The sailor, when questioned more carefully, admitted he could not be entirely certain of the name or even the year, and the hope dimmed back down into the same patient uncertainty Hester had long since learned to carry. There was the year the village school asked Hester to come once a week and teach the younger children the basics of planting and tending. She found a particular comfort in teaching a new generation of small, dirt-streaked hands the same lessons she had once taught her own son, and though it never replaced what she was missing, it gave her something useful to pour the waiting into. There was the year a young couple married on a bright early summer morning, and Hester, without being asked, gathered enough fresh lavender to fill small linen sachets for every guest. A quiet tradition the village came to expect from her at every wedding afterward. She told no one, though perhaps everyone understood it anyway, that it felt like sending some piece of her hope out into the world in whatever small way she still could. There was, among those 23 years, the particular year a hard frost came unusually early, catching the lavender still in late bloom. Hester stayed out past dark, covering as many rows as she could with old burlap sacking, refusing Albert's repeated offers of help until the work was nearly done. She saved perhaps 2/3 of that year's crop through sheer stubborn effort. There was the year a young apprentice gardener from a neighboring village came asking whether Hester might teach him her particular method of overwintering delicate lavender starts. Having heard, through the slow chain of village gossip that traveled farther than anyone quite expected, that the gardener at Hollow Bridge kept the healthiest lavender in the whole county, Hester spent several afternoons that spring showing him Thomas's old methods, the careful timing of the cuttings, the particular angle of glass that let in just enough winter light without scorching the tender new growth, and found herself, in teaching a stranger what she had once learned from a husband long dead, feeling oddly less alone in the carrying of it. There was the year the village nearly lost its bakery altogether, when Mrs. Whitcomb, exhausted and grieving still in the months after her husband's passing, spoke seriously of selling the building and moving to live with a sister in a larger town some distance away. It was the whole village, in the end, that quietly talked her out of it, neighbors taking turns covering her morning deliveries until her strength returned, Hester among them, walking the additional rounds before her own gardening each day for the better part of a month, simply so that one more steady thing in Hollow Bridge would not have to disappear before its time. There was a harder year still, when a fever not unlike the one that had taken Thomas swept briefly through Hollow Bridge, laying low nearly a dozen households at once. Hester, who had nursed her own husband through his final illness years before, found herself spending long nights at bedsides that were not her own, boiling water and changing linens and sitting quietly with frightened families until the worst of it passed. She lost no one she loved that particular year, though two elderly villagers did not see the spring, and she remembered it afterward less for its grief than for the strange comfort of being needed in a way that had nothing to do with her own private waiting. There was the year Hester very nearly sold the cottage, when a traveling land agent passed through Hollow Bridge offering what seemed, at the time, a generous sum for the property and its fields. She had stood at her own gate with his card in her hand for the better part of an afternoon, turning over in her mind the quieter life she might lead somewhere smaller, somewhere without quite so many empty rows to tend. In the end, she simply could not bring herself to do it, telling Albert only that the lavender had been planted for a reason she was not yet permitted to abandon, and the land agent's card found its way, eventually, into the bottom of a drawer she rarely opened. There was the year the villagers themselves organized a small fund to repair the worst of the loose stones on the old bridge, long before Edward would ever take up the proper work of it himself. The effort raised barely enough to patch a handful of the most dangerous spots, but Hester remembered it fondly all the same, remembered standing among neighbors with her sleeves rolled, passing stones hand to hand the way the whole village still occasionally came together when something old and shared needed tending. There was the year Albert himself, well into his 50s by then, was offered an easier posting at a larger sorting office 2 towns over, work that would have spared his aching knees the long bicycle rides through Hollow Bridge's hills. He turned it down without much deliberation, telling the regional supervisor only that he had certain rounds in the countryside he was not yet prepared to hand over to anyone else, a reason he never fully explained to Hester directly, though she suspected and was quietly grateful for exactly what he meant. There was the year a particularly fine harvest brought more lavender than Hester knew what to do with on her own, and she began, almost by accident, selling small bundles of it at the village market for the first time in years, simply to keep it from going to waste. The modest coins it brought in meant little to her financially, but something about the small, ordinary exchange, handing a bundle of lavender to a stranger in trade for a few pence, reminded her that her hands could still produce something the world found useful, even on the years when waiting felt like the only thing she had to show for them. There was the year a wandering preacher came through Hollow Bridge for a single Sunday, delivering a sermon about prodigal sons that left half the chapel in quiet tears, Hester among them, though she slipped out before anyone could press her about why. She walked the long way home that afternoon, past the bakery and the smithy and the schoolhouse, taking nearly twice as long as the direct lane required, simply to give herself room to compose her face before reaching her own gate. There was the year the village held its first proper celebration in nearly a decade for a couple's golden wedding anniversary. 50 years married without interruption, and the whole of Hollow Bridge turned out to honor it. Hester attended, smiled through the toasts, and admired the old couple's easy, practiced affection. Though she walked home alone that evening more aware than usual of the particular shape of her own house, built for two and occupied, for so long by only one. There was the year a young woman new to the village, recently widowed herself, sought Hester out specifically, having heard she was the person in Hollow Bridge who best understood what it meant to keep going after losing the center of one's household. Hester spent several afternoons that autumn simply sitting with her, offering no easy comfort, only the quiet example of a woman who had buried a husband and lost a son to silence and had still, somehow, kept her hands busy in the soil every single spring. There was the year a particularly hard summer drought threatened the entire lavender field, the soil cracking dry beneath rows that had never once failed her so completely. Hester hauled water by hand from the stream beneath the bridge for nearly 6 weeks straight, refusing the rest the village repeatedly urged on her, until the late autumn rains finally returned and the field, battered but alive, began slowly to recover. There was the year Mrs. Whitcomb, by then a genuine friend rather than merely a well-meaning neighbor, began closing her bakery early one afternoon each week simply to walk up and sit with Hester among the lavender rows, the two of them talking of nothing in particular, comfortable in the kind of silence that no longer needed filling. It became, over the following years, a small standing ritual between them, one neither woman ever formally arranged and neither ever missed. There was the year the chapel reverend, growing visibly older himself, began quietly preparing Hollow Bridge for the eventual arrival of his successor, the same thoughtful young curate who would later sit with Hester so often among her lavender. Hester watched that gentle transition unfold with a particular tenderness, recognizing in it the same slow, careful handing over of responsibility that she herself had once managed, in her own way, when Thomas's lavender rose became entirely hers to tend alone. There was the year the village welcomed a new young curate, a thoughtful, soft-spoken man who took to walking up occasionally in the early evenings simply to sit with Hester among the lavender. He never pressed her toward easy comfort, content instead simply to acknowledge that some waiting has no proper end date and deserves company regardless. These were the years, scattered among so many ordinary ones, that Hester carried quietly with her toward the 23rd spring. The spring that would, though she had no way yet of knowing it, finally bring her waiting to its long-delayed end. It was an ordinary Tuesday in early spring when that rhythm finally broke. Albert's bicycle came up the lane slower than usual, and from a distance, Hester noticed he was not riding with his usual ease. He stopped at her gate as he always did, but he did not meet her eyes right away, and his hands, normally so steady on the handlebars, seemed unwilling to let go of them. When he finally looked up, there was something in his face Hester had not seen there in all the years she had known him, a careful, uncertain kindness, as though he were holding something far heavier than the leather satchel slung across his shoulder. He explained it to her slowly, the way one might explain something they themselves were still struggling to believe. The regional sorting office, during a routine clearing of an old storage room, had uncovered a forgotten mail sack tucked behind a collapsed shelf, untouched for who knew how many years. A clerical error, decades old, had sent an entire batch of letters astray during a reorganization of postal routes, and rather than being returned or destroyed, the sack had simply been misplaced, forgotten in the quiet way that paperwork and good intentions are so easily forgotten. The office had spent the better part of a year quietly tracing names and addresses, doing what they could to deliver what time and carelessness had nearly erased. Among that sack of misplaced letters, addressed in handwriting Hester would have known anywhere, even after 23 years, even faded as it now was a letter bearing her name. Albert reached into his satchel and drew it out carefully, as though it might fall apart in his hands if he moved too quickly. The envelope had once been a plain cream color, the kind sold in any village shop, but the years in that forgotten sack had not been gentle with it. Water had gotten in at some point, leaving long pale stains across one corner where the ink had run and blurred beyond reading. The edges had softened and curled the way paper does when it has been damp and dried more than once. It was, in every visible way, a letter that should never have survived long enough to be delivered at all. Hester did not reach for it right away. She stood at her gate with her hands still covered in the morning soil, looking at the envelope the way one might look at a door that had been locked for so long. One had nearly forgotten there was a room behind it. Albert did not press her. He simply held it out, patient as he had always been, and waited for her to decide, in her own time, whether she was ready to take back into her hands the one thing she had waited 23 years to hold. When she finally did take it, her fingers trembled in a way they had not trembled in years of steady gardening work. She turned it over once, twice, searching the faded ink for some clue as to when it had been written, whether it had come from the early restless years of Edward's leaving or from some later point she knew nothing about. The postmark, like so much else on the envelope, had been worn nearly to nothing by water and time. There was no way to know, simply by looking, whether this letter held the words of a young man still finding his way in the world, or something written much later, by someone she might no longer fully recognize. Albert offered, gently, to stay while she opened it, the way an old friend offers company without insisting on it. Hester only shook her head and thanked him, the way she thanked him every morning for 23 years of nothing, except that this time there was something in her voice that had not been there before, something between hope and a fear too large to name. She carried the letter inside with both hands, set it on the small wooden table where she and Edward had once sat together by the fire, and stood looking down at it for a long while before she could bring herself to sit. The cottage felt different with the letter inside it, as though the air itself had shifted to make room for whatever it was about to reveal. Hester lit the lamp, though it was still early enough that she hardly needed it, simply for the comfort of its glow against the table. She thought, as she sat there, of every version of this moment she had imagined over the years, the apologies she had rehearsed receiving, the explanations she had told herself might one day arrive. She had imagined, more than once, that Edward had simply grown too busy, too far away, too consumed by the life he had gone looking for, to remember the mother who had stayed behind tending what he left. But she had also imagined, on her harder nights, that something else entirely might have kept him from writing, some trouble or circumstance beyond his choosing, the kind a mother dreads far more than simple neglect. She did not know, sitting there with the letter unopened before her, which of these she would rather discover to be true. A son who had chosen to forget her was a wound she had learned, slowly, to carry. A son who had wanted to write and could not was something she was no longer certain she had the strength to face. She thought, too, of the old greenhouse at the edge of the field, locked now for 23 years, and of the quiet, unfinished look that had passed across Edward's face the morning he left. She had never told anyone, not even Albert, what truly lay behind that fogged glass door. She wondered now, with the letter trembling slightly in her hands, whether whatever Edward had written might finally explain the things she had spent over 2 decades refusing to ask herself directly. The lamp burned low and steady beside her. Outside, the lavender field stretched quiet and undisturbed in the early light, rows upon rows of it, more than Thomas had ever planted, more than any reasonable person would plant for a son who might never return to see them bloom. Hester looked once more at the faded handwriting on the envelope, drew in a slow breath, and finally broke the seal. The paper inside was thinner than the envelope that had held it, soft with age and faintly stained where water had crept in along one edge, blurring whole words into pale, illegible smudges. But the handwriting at the top, though faded, was unmistakably the same hand that had once written her name on countless letters years before. "Dearest Mother," it began, and Hester felt something in her chest loosen at those 2 simple words, as though 23 years had folded themselves quietly away in an instant. Edward wrote that he had taken work aboard a merchant vessel out of a busy southern port, the kind of work that suited his restlessness in ways the quiet of Hollow Bridge never could. He described, in careful detail, the unfamiliar harbors he had seen, the strange fruits sold in foreign markets, the particular blue of waters far warmer than anything their little village stream had ever known. He wrote of these things with the same wide-eyed wonder Hester remembered from his childhood, when he used to ask her endless questions about bees and flowers and why the world worked the way it did. But woven through the wonder of distant places was something quieter, something Hester read more carefully the second time through. Edward wrote that he thought often of the lavender field, of the particular hush of early mornings spent walking the rows beside her, of the greenhouse at the field's edge that his father had built. He asked, almost shyly, whether the old glass panes still held against winter, and whether she still kept the key in the same place she always had. It was a small question, tucked between paragraphs of ships and harbors, but it was the question that made Hester's hands go still against the page. Then, in a passage Hester would read again and again in the days that followed, Edward's tone shifted from wonder to something far more uncertain. He wrote that he had sent letters before this one, several of them, over the course of his first years away, and that each one had gone unanswered. At first, he confessed, he had told himself the post was simply slow, that distance and unfamiliar ports made delivery uncertain. But as the silence stretched on, month after month, he had begun to wonder whether his leaving had wounded her more deeply than he understood, whether his last words to her before he left had been the wrong ones, and whether her silence was simply her way of telling him, gently, that it would be easier for them both if he did not return. He wrote that he did not blame her if that were true. He wrote that a mother who had already buried a husband to circumstances beyond her choosing had every right to protect what remained of her peace, even if that meant closing a door he himself had opened by leaving. But he wrote, too, that he could not quite make himself believe it, not entirely, not when he still remembered so clearly the particular way she used to look at him across the lavender rows, as though he were the most carefully tended thing in the entire field. Hester's breath caught at that passage, because she understood, with a sudden and aching clarity, what her son had spent years quietly believing. He had thought his letters reached her. He had thought her silence was a choice. He had never once imagined, sailing from port to port with his unanswered letters trailing behind him like something lost at sea, that the silence between them had never been hers to give at all. The next line on the page began with words Hester could almost make out. Something about a decision he had finally made. Something about a date, a return, a promise he intended to keep no matter how long the silence had lasted. But there, exactly where the letter seemed ready to tell her everything she had waited 23 years to know, the water damage had done its worst. The ink bled into an illegible pale smear across the remainder of the page, swallowing whatever Edward had written next, and leaving Hester staring down at a sentence that simply, unbearably, refused to finish. In the days that followed, Hester found it harder than she expected to return to her ordinary rhythm. She still rose early, still walked her rows of lavender each morning, but her hands moved with less certainty than before, often pausing mid-task as her thoughts drifted back to the unfinished sentence waiting on her kitchen table. The villagers who passed her on the lane noticed the change before she herself fully admitted to it. Hester Calloway, who had spent 23 years walking through Hollow Bridge with a calm no hardship seemed able to disturb, now carried herself like a woman waiting for something she could neither name nor explain to anyone who asked. Albert noticed first, as he always did. He began stopping longer at her gate each morning, no longer simply shaking his head and riding on, but lingering to ask, gently, whether there had been any further word. Hester told him what little she understood, that Edward had written of a decision, a date, perhaps even a return, but that the page itself had refused to say more. Albert, without being asked, offered to write on her behalf to the shipping company whose name appeared faintly on the letter's old postmark, in hopes that some record might still exist of where Edward had been bound after writing it. Hester accepted gratefully, though neither of them spoke aloud of how long such an inquiry might take to answer. It did not take long for whispers to begin moving through Hollow Bridge the way they always did in villages this small, passed quietly over garden walls and across the counter of the bakery until they had grown into something far larger than the few facts that had started them. Some said Hester had finally received word that her son had perished at sea years before, and that the letter Albert delivered was simply the last of his final words reaching her too late to matter. Others insisted the opposite, that Edward was very much alive and had simply built a new life abroad, with a family of his own he had never mentioned, and that his unfinished sentence had been an apology he lacked the courage to complete. Mrs. Whitcomb, who ran the village bakery and considered herself entitled to an opinion on every matter within Hollow Bridge's borders, took it upon herself one afternoon to suggest, not unkindly, that perhaps it was time for Hester to let the matter rest. She meant well, in her own blunt way, reasoning aloud that 23 years of silence rarely ended in good news, and that a woman of Hester's age owed herself some peace after carrying so much hope for so long without reward. Hester listened politely, thanked her for the thought, and bought her bread without offering a single word in argument. But that evening, she planted 3 more rows of lavender than she had intended, as though daring the world to prove Mrs. Whitcomb right. The nights grew harder than the days. Hester found herself, more often than she would have admitted to anyone, standing at the edge of her lavender field after dark, looking toward the old glass greenhouse where the moonlight caught faintly against its fogged panes. She had not opened that door in 23 years, not since the morning she and Edward stood inside it together before he left. But something about the unfinished letter made her wonder, for the first time in decades, whether the answer to all of it had been waiting behind that locked door the entire time, untouched and unconsidered, while she searched everywhere else for news of her son. It was nearly 3 weeks after the letter's arrival, on a foggy morning much like any other, that Albert came up the lane again with something in his satchel. This time, he did not slow with the careful hesitation he had shown before. He rode quickly, almost too quickly for a man his age on roads still slick with morning damp, and when he reached Hester's gate, he was nearly breathless. He held out not a letter this time, but a single folded reply from the shipping company. The ink still crisp and unmistakably modern. Nothing at all like the faded handwriting that had haunted Hester's kitchen table for the past 3 weeks. Hester took it from him with hands that had finally, after 23 years, stopped trembling, and opened it without a moment's hesitation. The reply from the shipping company was written in plain, official language, the kind meant for record-keeping rather than comfort, but Hester read every line of it as though it were the gentlest letter she had ever received. It confirmed that a man named Edward Calloway had indeed served aboard several merchant vessels beginning many years prior, and that records showed he had eventually left seafaring work altogether to settle in a small coastal town some distance south, where he had spent the better part of 2 decades working as a ship's carpenter. The company had no record of any family beyond the next of kin listed on his original enlistment papers, an address in a village called Hollow Bridge, which Hester realized, with a quiet ache, had simply been her own name, unchanged through all those years. What the letter could not explain, and what Hester would only learn days later through a careful exchange of further correspondence, was why Edward's letters had stopped reaching her at all. The answer, when it finally came, was almost unbearably simple. The same clerical error that had stranded an entire sack of mail in a forgotten storage room had begun. It seemed years earlier than anyone first realized, quietly swallowing letters from that particular shipping route long before the sack itself was ever discovered. Edward had written to her faithfully, for years longer than either of them had any way of knowing, and every single one of those letters had vanished into the same administrative oversight, never once reaching the cottage at the edge of the lavender field. Hester sat with that knowledge for a long while before she could fully absorb its weight. There had been no falling out. There had been no choice made, by her or by Edward, to let the silence stretch as long as it had. There had only been a forgotten sack of mail and a clerical mistake, indifferent to either of their hearts, quietly stealing 23 years from 2 people who had never stopped thinking of each other. It was not the dramatic betrayal the village whispers had imagined, nor the quiet abandonment Mrs. Whitcomb had gently warned her to accept. It was simply time, lost to carelessness, and now, at last, beginning to be returned. It was Albert, arriving once more at her gate a few days later, who brought the final piece of news. The shipping company, moved by the unusual nature of the inquiry, had taken the trouble to pass word along through an old colleague still living in Edward's coastal town. That colleague had gone, in person, to the address on record, and had returned with a message far simpler than anything Hester had dared hope for. Edward was alive. Edward was well. And Edward, upon learning that his mother had finally received even one of his letters after all these years, intended to return to Hollow Bridge himself, in person, before the season's lavender had finished blooming. Hester did not weep at the news, not at first, though something in her chest finally loosened after 23 years of holding itself carefully closed. She thought, instead, of the old glass greenhouse at the edge of the field, locked since the morning Edward left, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, exactly what she needed to do before her son came home. She walked to the greenhouse that same afternoon, the small brass key trembling slightly in her hand, and unlocked the door for the first time in over 2 decades. Inside, beneath a layer of dust and the soft green light filtering through fogged glass, she found exactly what she somehow already knew she would. A small wooden chest, built by Thomas's own hands years before, sat exactly where Edward had left it the morning he walked away from Hollow Bridge. Inside it were dozens of letters, each one sealed and dated, written by Edward in the days before his departure, one for every year he had imagined himself away, in case the post between them ever failed. He had left them there, unopened, asking her once, quietly, to wait for his return before reading them together, rather than letting the years apart be carried alone. Hester had simply forgotten, in all the waiting, that he had ever asked. The day Edward returned to Hollow Bridge began like any other late spring morning, with fog settling low over the lavender field and the village waking slowly beneath gray morning light. Hester had taken to watching the lane each day since Albert's news, though she told herself she was simply tending her rows as always, pausing only now and then to glance toward the stone bridge where, 23 years before, her son had walked away with little more than a single travel case. She did not know which day he would arrive, only that he had promised to come before the lavender finished blooming, and so each morning she rose a little earlier than necessary, just in case. It was Albert once again who saw him first. He had taken to extending his morning rounds slightly, riding the long way past the stone bridge before continuing up toward Hester's cottage, and on this particular morning, he spotted a figure crossing into the village on foot, a man somewhere in his 40s, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had spent years doing physical work, with a weathered face that nonetheless carried something unmistakably familiar in the set of its jaw and the quiet way it studied the old stone bridge before stepping onto it. Albert nearly lost his balance on his bicycle, steadying himself only at the last moment, before turning to ride as quickly as his aging legs would carry him back up the lane toward Hester's cottage. Hester was kneeling among her lavender rows when Albert's bicycle came skidding up the path far faster than was his custom, and she rose to her feet with soil still clinging to her hands, certain from the look on his face alone that something important had finally happened. Albert, too breathless at first to speak properly, simply pointed back down the lane toward the village, toward the stone bridge, and managed only a single word between gasps for air. "He is here." Hester did not wait to hear anything more. She set down the small trowel still in her hand, wiped her palms once against her apron, and began walking down the lane toward the bridge with a steadiness that surprised even her, as though 23 years of patience had prepared her exactly for this single, unhurried walk. The village seemed to sense, in the particular way small villages always do, that something significant was unfolding, and by the time Hester reached the high street, a few curious faces had already gathered at windows and doorways, drawn by Albert's hurried bicycle and the unusual sight of Hester walking toward the village rather than away from it. She paid them no mind. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the figure standing at the far end of the stone bridge, still and uncertain, as though he too were not quite sure how to close the last remaining distance between 23 years of separation and the mother he had left behind. Edward recognized her before she fully recognized him, though perhaps that was only because he had spent so many quiet evenings imagining this exact moment, picturing his mother's face across every ocean and every harbor he had ever sailed through. She was older now, her hair more silver than he remembered, her shoulders carrying the particular stoop of decades spent bent over garden rows, but her eyes, when they finally met his across the bridge, held exactly the same steady warmth he had carried with him through every year of his absence. Neither of them spoke right away. They simply stood at opposite ends of the same worn stone bridge that had carried his departure and now carried his return, each studying a face that time had changed and yet somehow left entirely recognizable. It was Hester who finally crossed the remaining distance first, her steps quickening despite herself, until she reached her son and took his face gently between both of her soil-marked hands, the way she had done countless times when he was still a boy following her through the lavender rows. Edward, taller now than the young man who had left, bent his head slightly to meet her eyes more fully, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. There was no need, in that particular moment, for words to carry what 23 years of separation and an honest, careless mistake had nearly stolen from them both. When words finally did come, they came slowly and quietly, the way conversation tends to unfold between two people who have far too much to say and no wish to rush through any of it. Edward apologized first, for the years of silence he had wrongly believed to be her choosing, and Hester stopped him gently, telling him there was nothing for either of them to apologize for, that a forgotten sack of mail and a careless clerk had taken something from them both equally, and that the only thing left to do now was to stop mourning the years they had lost and begin, instead, to notice the years still ahead of them. They walked back together along the lane, past the bakery and the chapel and the row of cottages with their crooked chimneys, while villagers who had gathered to watch offered quiet nods rather than the usual eager questions, sensing, in the unhurried way Hester and Edward walked side by side, that this was not yet a moment for conversation beyond their own. Even Mrs. Whitcomb, who had so confidently advised Hester weeks before to let the matter rest, stood silently in her bakery doorway as they passed, offering nothing more than a small, humbled smile. Back at the cottage, Hester led her son first to the kitchen table, where the original letter still sat, its unfinished sentence faded but no longer quite so painful to look upon now that the man who had written it stood beside her once more. But it was the old glass greenhouse she led him to next, unlocking the door they had not opened together since the morning he left, and there, in the soft green light filtering through fogged panes, she showed him the small wooden chest of sealed letters he had left behind all those years before, each one dated, each one waiting patiently through 23 years for the day they might finally be opened together, exactly as he had once asked. Edward knelt beside the small wooden chest his father had built so many years before, running his fingers briefly across its lid before lifting it open, as though greeting an old friend he had nearly forgotten he once knew this well. Inside, the letters lay exactly as he had left them, each one sealed, each one dated in his own younger handwriting along the corner, arranged in careful order from the earliest days of his planned absence onward. He had written them all those years ago in a single quiet evening before leaving, never fully believing he would need them, yet unable to walk away without leaving some kind of safeguard behind, in case the post between Hollow Bridge and wherever he ended up ever failed them both. Hester lowered herself onto the small wooden bench beside him, the same bench Thomas had built into the greenhouse decades before, and together they opened the earliest letter first. Edward's younger voice rose softly from the page as Hester read it aloud, full of the restless excitement of a young man stepping onto his first ship, describing the size of the harbor, the strange creak of rope and timber beneath his boots, the particular quality of moonlight on open water that no village stream could ever quite imitate. He had written even then that he missed the lavender already, and that he hoped, wherever he ended up, the air might someday carry even a faint trace of it. They moved through the letters slowly, one season at a time, watching the younger Edward's handwriting grow steadier and more confident with each passing year, his sentences settling into the rhythms of a man finding his place in the world rather than simply searching for it. He wrote of ports and storms and friendships made among fellow sailors, of slowly learning the careful craft of shipbuilding that would eventually become his trade. And in nearly every letter, Tucked somewhere between the larger adventures was some small mention of home, a memory of bees in the lavender rose, a question about whether the greenhouse glass still held against winter frost, a quiet hope that his mother was managing well enough without him. The later letters, written as the years stretched on without any reply reaching him, grew gentler in tone, less certain, more searching. Edward had written, in one particularly worn page, that he sometimes feared his mother's silence meant she had finally allowed herself the peace of letting him go entirely, and that if this were true, he would not blame her for it, though he could not quite bring himself to stop writing all the same. Hester's voice caught slightly as she read that passage aloud, and Edward reached over to rest his hand gently over hers on the page, neither of them needing to say aloud how unnecessary that particular fear had always been. The final letter in the chest, dated only a few months before the mail sack itself had finally been discovered, was shorter than the others. Written, Edward explained quietly, on the evening he had decided to finally save enough to return home in person rather than continue trusting letters that never seemed to reach her. He had written simply that he intended to come back to Hollow Bridge himself, lavender season or not, post office failures or not, and see for himself whether the rose his father once planted, and he himself had grown up tending, still bloomed exactly as he remembered them. Hester folded that final letter closed with careful hands, looked up at her son sitting beside her in the soft green light of the greenhouse, and said simply that they had, in fact, bloomed every single year, waiting patiently for exactly this. They sat together a while longer after the last letter had been read, not speaking much, simply allowing the weight of 23 recovered years to settle quietly between them in a place that had once felt unbearably empty and now felt, for the first time in decades, entirely complete. Outside the fogged glass walls, the afternoon had begun its slow drift toward evening, the light over the lavender field turning the particular soft gold that only ever seemed to visit Hollow Bridge in the hour before dusk. Eventually, without needing to discuss it, they rose together, locked the greenhouse door behind them out of old habit rather than necessity, and walked back toward the cottage to begin the quiet, unhurried business of simply being together again. That evening, for the first time in 23 years, Hester lit the lamp in her kitchen for two rather than one, and the village of Hollow Bridge, sensing somehow that whatever quiet mystery had surrounded the lavender field for so long had finally come to its gentle end, settled into its own evening rhythms with a particular softness, as though the entire place had exhaled something it had been holding for a very long time. That evening, Hester and Edward sat together at the small kitchen table where she had once read his unfinished letter alone, only now there was bread between them, and tea steaming gently in two mismatched cups, and the particular quiet that settles over a home when it finally holds exactly the right number of people inside it. Edward told her, slowly and without hurry, about the small coastal town he had called home for most of his years away, about the modest workshop where he had learned to shape wood into the ribs and hulls of ships, about the particular satisfaction of watching something he had built with his own hands carry other people safely across water. Hester listened the way she always had, asking gentle questions, content simply to let her son's voice fill the cottage after so many years of silence. Outside, the light over Hollow Bridge continued its slow fade from gold to a deep, settled blue, the kind of evening color that seemed to soften every edge of the village at once. Smoke began rising from chimneys along the high street, thin and unhurried, as families settled in for their own evening meals. The bakery had long since closed its shutters for the night, though the faint warm smell of the day's last loaves still lingered in the air around its doorway. Somewhere near the chapel, a single bell rang the evening hour, soft and unhurried, the sound carrying easily across the still village air and out toward the lavender field, where the rose stood quiet and undisturbed beneath the gathering dusk. Albert Finch, having finally caught his breath after the excitement of the day, sat on his own small porch a short walk from Hester's cottage. His bicycle leaned against the fence beside him, a cup of tea cooling slowly in his hands as he watched the last of the daylight fade from the sky. He had known Hester since they were children chasing geese along the riverbank, and he found himself, in this particular quiet evening, feeling something close to the satisfaction of having delivered, after 23 years, exactly the kind of news a postman hopes someday to carry. He finished his tea slowly, listening to the soft sounds of the village settling around him, and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, an evening entirely free of worry. Across the village, in the small cottages lining the high street, similar quiet rituals were unfolding in their own unhurried way. Lamps were being lit one by one against the gathering dark, their warm glow spilling softly through old glass windows onto the cobblestones below. Children were being called in from the lanes where they had lingered past the dinner hour, their small voices fading into the murmur of family conversation behind closed doors. Somewhere, a kettle began to whistle gently on a stove, and somewhere else, the soft creak of a rocking chair marked the slow rhythm of an evening spent simply sitting, watching the last of the daylight disappear beyond the low hills surrounding Hollow Bridge. The stream beneath the old stone bridge continued its quiet, unhurried passage through the village. The same cold, clear water that had run beneath those worn stones for longer than anyone could properly remember. It moved past the bakery, past the chapel, past the lane leading up toward the lavender field, indifferent to the particular joys and sorrows unfolding in the cottages above it, carrying instead only the steady, patient rhythm it had always known. There was something comforting in that indifference, in the way the stream simply continued, the way the bridge simply stood, the way certain things in Hollow Bridge had always remained exactly as they were, regardless of how much had changed in the lives of the people who lived beside them. Hester had told Edward on that first exhausted evening of his return that the rest of his stories could wait until morning. And so they did, though morning stretched, in the way these things often do, into many mornings and just as many quiet evenings after, each one bringing some new piece of the 23 years Hester had missed. On one such evening, Edward told her about the storm that had nearly ended his life before his work as a sailor had properly begun. Caught 2 days from the nearest harbor with seas rising taller than the deck rails. He had written to her the very next morning, describing it in detail, a letter that, like so many others, had simply vanished. On another evening, he told her about Captain Holloway, the gruff, weathered man who had taught him the careful craft of working wood, correcting his grip on a chisel, showing him how to read the grain of a plank before cutting it, passing along a trade that would eventually become his entire livelihood. There was an evening, harder than the others, when Edward told her about Thomas Pruitt, a young deckhand who had become the closest thing to a brother he'd found in all his years away, lost overboard during a routine transfer of cargo. He told Hester it was Thomas's death, more than anything else, that had first made him truly afraid his own letters might be failing to find her. On a gentler evening, he told her about Aldermore, the coastal town where he learned shipbuilding properly, the particular quality of light over its harbor each evening, the slow friendships built among fellow tradesmen. Even his happiest memories of it, Hester noticed, carried a faint undercurrent of homesickness he had apparently never quite managed to shake. There was one evening, spoken more carefully than the rest, when Edward told her about Margaret, a baker's daughter he had courted for nearly 2 years, who had eventually asked him plainly whether he intended to make a life there with her. He hadn't been able to answer, because some part of him remained tethered elsewhere, and Margaret had eventually married a local fisherman instead. Hester said little, only reached over and held her son's hand for a long moment. On another evening, Edward described Port Avon, the largest harbor he had ever worked in, and the particular bewilderment of his first weeks there, fresh off a smaller coastal route and entirely unprepared for its scale. There was an evening when he told her about a fever that had swept through his ship off a distant southern coast, and how, in his worst fevered hours, he had dreamed repeatedly of the lavender field, certain he could smell it even there. On a quieter evening, he told her about a winter spent as a guest in Captain Holloway's own household, the closest thing to a family table he had known in all his years away. There was an evening nearer the end of these long retellings, when Edward described the first vessel he had ever built almost entirely with his own hands, and how strange and satisfying it felt to watch it finally launched and proven sound, thinking of his mother more in that moment than almost any other. On what became one of the last of these long storytelling evenings, Edward told her about the night he had finally decided, once and for all, to stop trusting letters and simply save enough to come home in person. A calculation he kept taped inside an old shipping ledger, updating it faithfully every season until the morning he finally crossed the stone bridge into Hollow Bridge. Hester asked him why he had waited as long as he had once the decision was made. Edward told her that some part of him had been afraid, even after deciding, that the village he returned to might no longer hold a place for him, that 23 years was simply too long a silence for any mother to forgive, regardless of its true cause. There was an evening when Edward told her about the particular silence of standing watch alone on deck during the smallest hours of the night, far from any coastline, nothing visible in any direction but black water and a sky thick with more stars than Hollow Bridge's smaller patch of darkness had ever shown him. He said he had thought of her often during those solitary watches, picturing her asleep in the cottage beneath the same general turning of stars, taking a strange comfort in the idea that whatever ocean or distance separated them, the same quiet sky still somehow stretched between their two unreachable points. There was a final evening, near the end of these long retellings, when Edward admitted to her that the hardest part of his years away had never actually been the distance or the silence itself, difficult as both had been, but rather the slow, creeping uncertainty of not knowing which version of the story was true, whether he was a son still loved and simply unreachable, or a son who had, through some failure of his own, been quietly released from that love altogether. He said that not knowing had been harder, in its own way, than any storm or fever or lonely watch he had endured, and Hester, hearing this, understood with a fresh ache exactly how closely her own 23 years of uncertainty had mirrored his. On one of the gentler evenings, Edward described the strict discipline of saving for his eventual return. The small tin he had kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his rented room, into which he had dropped whatever coins he could spare after each month's expenses, watching it fill with a patience that surprised even him. He told her he had named no particular amount as his final goal at first, only kept adding to it steadily, until the morning he finally counted it and realized, almost without quite planning to, that it was enough. There was an evening when he told her about the loneliest Christmas of his years away, spent entirely alone in his rented room above the chandler's shop while the rest of Aldermore celebrated with families he had no claim to join. He had walked the empty harbor that evening instead, watching the boats rock gently at anchor under a cold, clear sky, and had found himself, for reasons he could not fully explain even now, humming one of the old carols Hollow Bridge's chapel choir used to sing, the tune carrying him, for a few strange minutes, almost all the way home. On another evening, Edward told her about the apprentices he had eventually trained himself. Once his own skill with wood had grown steady enough to teach it onward, passing along Captain Holloway's careful methods to a new generation of young hands the same way they had once been passed to him. He said he had thought, more than once while correcting some young apprentice's grip on a chisel, of his mother teaching him among the lavender rows, and had understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly how much of what we are eventually given, we are simply meant to give onward again. There was one last evening of these long retellings when Edward confessed that he had kept, folded carefully inside his travel case through every single move and every single year, one of Albert's old newspapers from Hollow Bridge, the edges gone soft and the print nearly illegible from handling, simply because it had been the last piece of home he carried away with him. Hester asked to see it, and Edward retrieved it carefully from a drawer in his old room, and the two of them sat together that evening reading aloud, slowly, whatever fragments of the old newsprint remained legible, laughing softly at how small and ordinary the village news of so many years ago now seemed, and how precious it had apparently once been to a homesick young man on the other side of the world. There was an evening when Edward described the harbor festival Aldermore held each year at the height of summer. Boats strung with lanterns and the whole waterfront filled with music and the smell of grilled fish, a celebration he had attended faithfully for years without ever quite feeling he belonged to it the way the families around him seemed to. He told Hester he had always found himself, at some point in the evening, slipping away from the noise to sit alone at the edge of the harbor, watching the lantern lights scatter across the dark water, wondering whether Hollow Bridge held any celebration half so bright, and missing, with a particular sharpness, the quieter pleasures of a village he had once been so eager to leave. On another evening, he told her about the long, slow process of learning to read the weather by the particular color of the sky at dusk, a skill every experienced sailor eventually came to trust more than any instrument, and how Captain Holloway had taught it to him through nothing more than patient repetition, pointing out one evening after another which particular shade of red or gray meant calm seas ahead and which meant trouble. Edward said he still found himself, even now, glancing automatically at the evening sky over Hollow Bridge out of old habit, reading weather that no longer needed reading, for a voyage he no longer needed to make. There was an evening, lighter than most, when Edward told her about the ship's cat that had lived aboard one of his earlier vessels, a scrappy, one-eared creature the crew had simply called Mr., who slept curled in the warmest corner of the galley and considered himself, by all observable evidence, to be the vessel's true captain. He said the sailors had been absurdly fond of that cat, had smuggled him scraps and built him a small box for rough weather, and had genuinely grieved, in their gruff sailor's way, when old age finally caught up with him somewhere off a southern coast. Hester laughed at this story more than any other, delighted to learn that her son's hard years at sea had still held room for something so simply silly. There was an evening when Edward spoke, more seriously, about the particular guilt he had carried for years over the very last conversation they'd had before he left, replaying it in his memory more times than he could count, wondering whether some different choice of words might have changed everything that followed. Hester told him gently that she had done the very same thing, turning that same final evening over and over in her own memory for 23 years, and that perhaps it was simply the nature of partings to feel, afterward, as though they ought to have gone differently, regardless of how little they actually had to do with what came next. These evenings of stories continued, one after another, through that first season of Edward's return, each one filling in some small piece of the 23 years Hester had spent imagining far worse than the truth had ever actually held. Albert Finch had never spoken much of his own early years, content to remain, in the eyes of most of Hollow Bridge, simply the steady postman who had always seemed to belong exactly where he was. But Hester remembered well enough the particular quiet that had settled over him after his own mother passed when he was barely 16, leaving him the sole keeper of a small cottage and a grief he had carried, in his own unhurried way, for the whole of his life since. He had never married, several quiet courtships in his younger years having simply dissolved into nothing more than friendly distance, as though some part of him remained too occupied tending to the village's small joys and sorrows to properly attend to his own. He had become, almost without anyone deciding it formally, the village's unofficial keeper of memory, carrying Hester's particular grief more carefully than most, never once allowing himself to stop riding that same lane each day in 23 years. He had told no one how deeply Edward's eventual return had moved him, how many quiet evenings afterward he had sat alone on his own porch marveling at the privilege of having been the one entrusted to finally carry the news that ended her waiting. In the months following, he found himself welcomed at Hester's table more often than ever, content to listen as much as speak, feeling he had been given a kind of family by proximity, a place at a table he had helped, in his own small way, to finally make whole again. Back in Hester's cottage, the evening had settled into something even quieter than before. Edward had grown tired in the particular way that comes from carrying a long journey and an even longer reunion in the same single day, and Hester, noticing the heaviness beginning to gather behind his eyes, suggested gently that the rest of his stories could wait until morning. She showed him to the small room that had once been his as a boy, unchanged in most of its details, the same narrow bed pushed against the same window overlooking the lavender field, the same faded quilt folded neatly at its foot. Edward thanked her quietly, and for a long moment, simply stood in the doorway of his old room, taking in a space that had waited for him, patiently, for 23 years. Hester left him to settle in and returned to her own small bedroom across the narrow hallway, moving through her nightly rituals with the same unhurried care she always had. She washed the day's soil from her hands, unpinned her hair, and sat for a moment at the edge of her bed, listening to the particular quiet of a house with two people sleeping under its roof again. Through her window, the lavender field stretched out beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars, its rose barely visible now except as a deeper shadow against the darkening earth, patient and unmoving, exactly as they had been every night for 23 years, and exactly as they would continue to be for many nights still to come. Sleep came to Hollow Bridge slowly that night, the way it always did, settling first over the youngest children tucked into their beds, then drifting outward through the village to reach even the latest risers among its older residents. Mrs. Whitcomb closed her bakery's upstairs shutters and allowed herself, for once, a quiet smile before drifting off, thinking of the unusual joy she had witnessed on the high street earlier that day. The chapel bell did not ring again until morning, its silence its own kind of comfort, a sign that the village had finally settled into the stillness it depended on each night to restore itself for the day ahead. Out at the edge of the lavender field, the old glass greenhouse stood quiet in the darkness, its panes catching only the faintest trace of starlight, its small wooden chest now empty of letters but somehow no less meaningful for having been emptied. The greenhouse had kept its quiet promise for 23 years, sheltering Edward's words through frost and fog and the long indifferent passage of time. And now, its purpose fulfilled, it simply stood as it always had, a small stone and glass structure at the edge of a field, waiting for nothing in particular, content simply to exist in the place Thomas had built it so many years before. Morning came to Hollow Bridge the way it always did, slowly, with a pale gray light first softening the edges of the lavender field before warming, gradually, into the particular gold that seemed to belong only to mornings in that quiet corner of the countryside. Hester woke before the sun had fully cleared the low hills, as she had every morning for over 20 years, though for the first time in just as long, she lay still a moment longer than necessary, listening to the unfamiliar comfort of footsteps moving softly in the room across the hallway. She rose eventually, dressed in her usual simple way, and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Edward already awake, standing at the window with a cup of tea in hand, looking out at the field exactly as he used to as a boy. They walked the rows together that first morning, Hester pointing out which section she had replanted over the years and which still held the same lavender Thomas had first planted decades before. The older stalks grown thick and woody with age, still faithfully producing their soft purple blooms each spring regardless of how much time had passed. Edward knelt occasionally to touch the soil the way he used to as a child, asking questions again in that same relentless way, though this time about the practical matters of harvest and drying rather than the simple wonder of why bees came in such numbers. Hester answered patiently, grateful simply for the chance to teach him again, after so many years of wondering whether she ever would. News of Edward's return spread quickly through Hollow Bridge in the days that followed, carried village to village in the particular efficient way that small communities share information, through bakery counters and chapel doorsteps and the casual conversations exchanged across garden walls. Villagers who had spent 23 years quietly speculating about Hester's locked greenhouse and unexplained extra rows of lavender now found themselves, somewhat sheepishly, offering warm congratulations instead of curious questions. Mrs. Whitcomb, true to her practical nature, simply began setting aside an extra loaf each week for Hester's cottage, as though feeding two mouths instead of one required no further comment beyond the bread itself. Albert continued his morning rounds much as he always had, though his pace up the lane toward Hester's cottage had grown noticeably more relaxed, no longer carrying the particular weight of delivering nothing, year after year, to a woman who deserved so much better from the post. He took to staying longer at the gate each morning, sharing tea with Hester and, increasingly, with Edward as well, the three of them settling into an easy rhythm of conversation that filled what had once been 23 years of careful, unspoken silence. It was Albert, in fact, who first suggested that Edward consider putting his shipbuilding skills to use repairing the old stone bridge at the village center, whose worn surface had grown increasingly uneven over the years from decades of unattended wear. Edward took to the work eagerly, finding in the bridge's repair a particular satisfaction similar to the careful labor he had grown accustomed to in distant shipyards, though this time the work kept him close to home rather than carrying him away from it. He spent his mornings now divided between the lavender field and the bridge, tending one in the soft early light before walking down to spend his afternoons carefully resetting loosened stones and smoothing worn edges, watched over by curious village children who had grown fond of asking him about the distant ports he had once described in his letters home. In the evenings, he returned to Hester's cottage tired in the satisfying way that comes from honest work, ready for the quiet meals and unhurried conversation that had become their shared evening ritual. As the weeks passed, the lavender field reached the height of its summer bloom, rows upon rows of soft purple stretching from the cottage all the way to the edge of the lane, drawing bees in numbers that seemed, even to Hester's experienced eye, more abundant than any season she could recall. She harvested it slowly, with Edward's help now rather than alone, the two of them moving through the rows together in companionable quiet, cutting careful bundles and hanging them to dry along the rafters of the old greenhouse, which had finally returned, after 23 years, to its original simple purpose of sheltering delicate things through difficult seasons. The village settled, too, into its own particular acceptance of this quiet change in its midst. Hollow Bridge had never been a place where dramatic news lingered long in conversation, and within a season, Edward's return had become simply another familiar thread woven into the ordinary fabric of village life, no longer remarkable except in the quiet satisfaction it brought to those who had watched Hester wait so faithfully for so long. Children who had once been curious about the locked greenhouse now simply knew it as the place where lavender dried each summer. The stone bridge, freshly repaired, carried foot traffic and cartwheels with renewed steadiness, indifferent now to whether anyone remembered it as the place where a mother and son had once stood reunited after 23 years apart. As the long days of summer began to shorten, the lavender field entered its final cutting of the year, and Hester found herself, for the first time in over 2 decades, doing the work alongside someone whose hands moved with a steadiness that nearly matched her own. Edward had taken naturally back into the rhythm of the harvest, as though his years away had only sharpened rather than dulled the instincts she had first taught him as a boy. They moved together through the rows in the cool morning air, cutting careful bundles of the last blooms before the frost could claim them, tying them with the same plain twine Thomas had once used, and hanging them along the rafters of the greenhouse to dry in the same slow, patient way the lavender had always been dried in that family. The greenhouse, once a place of locked silence, had become something else entirely in the months since Edward's return. Its glass panes, cleaned now of decades of dust, let in soft autumn light that fell across rows of drying lavender bundles, filling the small structure with a fragrance so concentrated that even villagers passing along the lane below sometimes paused, without quite knowing why, to breathe it in more deeply. The village held its harvest gathering that year on a mild evening in early autumn, much as it always had. It was the first such evening Edward had attended in over 2 decades, and the children of Hollow Bridge took to him almost immediately, gathering around him to ask about the ships he had sailed and the harbors he had seen, about whether the ocean truly stretched on forever the way their schoolbooks claimed. Albert Finch, too, found himself drawn into easy conversation that evening, content to let himself simply be the steady, familiar presence he had always been. Hester, watching him laugh at something one of the younger villagers had said, found herself grateful, in a way she had perhaps never properly expressed to him, for the particular gift of his steady friendship across all those empty years. That night, a gentle autumn rain began to fall over Hollow Bridge, the kind of soft, steady rain that seemed to settle rather than disturb. Hester and Edward sat by the fire in the cottage, listening to it patter against the old glass windows Thomas had once set into their frames. Edward mentioned, almost in passing, that he had nearly forgotten how comforting the sound of rain on old glass could be, after so many years of listening instead to water against a ship's hull. The first frost came to Hollow Bridge not long after, settling thin and silver over the lavender field on a clear, cold morning. Hester walked the dormant rows slowly that morning, Edward beside her, both of them quiet in the particular way that comes naturally to people who no longer need conversation to feel close to one another. Winter settled over Hollow Bridge slowly, the way it always did, the days growing shorter and the gas lamps along the high street being lit earlier each evening to hold back the gathering dark. Snow came in gentle, unhurried falls, dusting the rooftops and the old stone bridge in soft white. Edward finished the last of the bridge repairs on a particularly still winter afternoon, setting the final smooth stone into place with the same careful attention he had given every piece of work since returning home. The village held its winter gathering at the chapel as it did every year. Candles lit along every windowsill and a fire kept burning in the small hearth at the back of the room to ward off the cold. Hester found herself, more than once during the service, glancing sideways at her son beside her, still faintly astonished, even after all these months, that he was simply there, present, no longer a distant ache but an ordinary, comforting fact of her daily life. On the last evening of that year, Hester and Edward sat together by the fire as the village outside settled into the particular hush that comes only on the quietest nights of winter. Hester thought, as the fire burned low and the cottage grew warm and still around them, that this was perhaps the simplest gift the whole strange, slow story had finally given her. Not grand reunion or dramatic revelation, but simply this, an ordinary winter evening, shared, unremarkable, and entirely enough. When spring finally returned to Hollow Bridge, it arrived the way it always had, slowly at first, with the lavender fields' dormant rose beginning to show the faintest traces of new green beneath soil still cool from winter. Hester and Edward walked those rows together on the first truly warm morning of the season, checking each plant the way she had once checked them alone, year after empty year, except now there were two sets of hands doing the work. They planted new rows that spring as they always had, though this time without the particular ache that had once accompanied each planting. There was no need for that particular kind of hoping anymore. They planted instead simply because the lavender deserved tending, because some rhythms are worth keeping not out of longing but out of the simple, settled pleasure of continuing something good. Albert's mornings, too, had changed with the turning of the season. He still rode the same worn path up to Hester's cottage each day, though now his satchel carried the ordinary business of village life rather than the particular weight of expectation it had carried for so many years. He no longer needed to give the small shake of his head he had given for over 2 decades, and though he never said so directly, there was a particular lightness in his bicycle bell each morning now. On the first anniversary of Edward's return, the village marked the occasion with a small, informal gathering at Hester's own cottage, neighbors arriving through the lavender field at dusk with offerings of bread and preserves and simple, well-meant company. Albert raised a modest toast that evening to patience, to honest mistakes finally corrected, and to the particular stubbornness of lavender that insists on blooming whether or not anyone is certain it will ever be seen. The Reverend, attending that same gathering, offered a brief and characteristically gentle word of his own, observing that he had buried and blessed a great many stories in his long years at Hollow Bridge, but precious few had ever circled back around to such a quiet, complete sort of joy. As that gathering finally wound down, Hester stood a while longer at her own gate, watching the small lights disperse along the familiar paths of Hollow Bridge, each one finding its own way home through the same quiet darkness that had settled over the village every night for as long as she could remember. She thought, watching them go, that waiting, however long it stretches, however uncertain its ending, is rarely carried entirely alone. In the years that followed, the story of the lavender gardener and her son settled gradually into the particular kind of local legend that small villages quietly collect and retell, softened and rounded at its edges the way all such stories eventually become. The greenhouse remained standing at the edge of the field for many years afterward, still used each season for drying lavender exactly as it always had been. Hester lived long enough to see her own grandchildren walk those same rows of lavender, small boots leaving prints in soil that had, by then, been tended by 3 generations of the same patient hands, and she told them, when they were old enough to ask, the story of the lavender she had planted every single year for 23 years, waiting for a son she never stopped believing would return. In the second year after Edward's return, the rhythms of Hollow Bridge settled into something even steadier than the cautious joy of that first year had allowed. Hester no longer woke each morning faintly astonished to find her son still present in the house. His presence had become, by then, simply one of the fixed facts of her days, as ordinary and as treasured as the lavender itself. They moved through the planting and harvesting together with an ease that no longer required conscious thought, two sets of hands working the same soil with the particular wordless coordination that only comes from years, or in their case, a single patient lifetime of shared labor. Albert, too, had settled fully into the gentler rhythm of his later rounds, his bicycle bell ringing each morning with nothing heavier in its satchel than the ordinary business of village life. He had grown a little grayer that year, his knees a little stiffer on the hills, but he showed no sign of slowing his rounds, telling anyone who asked that he intended to keep riding up to Hester's cottage every morning for as long as his legs would carry him. A promise he had quietly kept for over 20 years already, and saw no particular reason to break now that the worst of the waiting was finally over. That second spring brought a new addition to the village's quiet rhythms. When Edward, restless in the particular way of a man who had spent his whole working life with his hands busy, began offering his shipbuilding skills more widely throughout Hollow Bridge, repairing not only the old stone bridge but the wagon wheels and cart axles and the occasional leaking roof of any neighbor who needed steady hands and could not easily afford to call in help from the larger towns. He never charged more than the cost of materials, and often not even that, content simply to have useful work that kept him close to the village that had waited so patiently for his return. Mrs. Whitcomb's weekly visits to the lavender field had, by then, become a fixture of village life almost as reliable as the bakery's morning bread, and the two women had grown close enough that Hester finally told her, one quiet autumn afternoon among the drying lavender, the full story of the locked greenhouse and the chest of unopened letters, details she had shared with almost no one else in the village. Mrs. Whitcomb listened without interruption, and at the end simply reached over and took Hester's hand, saying only that she was glad, after everything, to have been wrong about how the story would end. The new young curate, settling more fully into his role as the aging Reverend's health began gently declining, took to walking up to the lavender field even more often than before, no longer simply to sit with Hester in her solitary waiting, but now to share supper with the whole small household, Edward included, the three of them and occasionally Albert too, gathering around Hester's table on quiet evenings to discuss everything and nothing in particular. The curate confided once, to Hester alone, that he had taken his calling to Hollow Bridge partly because he had heard, even before arriving, the quiet legend of a woman who planted lavender every year for a son who might never return, and had wanted, in some small way, to be present for whatever ending that particular story eventually found. The village school, in the years that followed, began including the story of the lavender gardener in its informal lessons on patience and kindness, the schoolteacher finding it a gentler illustration for young children than most of the harder moral tales typically reached for. Hester, visiting occasionally to help with the garden plot as she had for years, found herself sometimes overhearing snatches of her own story repeated back to her by small, dirt-streaked children who had no idea the woman teaching them to plant seeds was the very same woman the story was about, and she always simply smiled and let the lesson continue undisturbed. As the years accumulated gently rather than painfully now, Hollow Bridge itself changed in small, ordinary ways around the lavender field that had once stood as its quietest mystery. The old chapel finally received its long-overdue repairs to the roof, the bakery passed eventually from Mrs. Whitcomb's hands to her nieces, and the stone bridge that Edward had once restored carried, over the following decades, the weight of countless more cartwheels and boots than either of them could have predicted on the morning of his return. Through all of it, the lavender continued its same patient rhythm. Planted each spring, harvested each summer, dried each autumn in the old greenhouse that had once guarded nothing but silence and now guarded nothing at all, simply existing, exactly as it always had, at the edge of a field that had finally stopped waiting. In the smithy at the edge of the village, Samuel Birch had grown into a settled contentment of his own in the years since Hester had gently turned aside his quiet courtship, eventually marrying a widow from a neighboring parish and raising, between them, a small household of stepchildren who filled his evenings with noise he had not realized he was missing. He bore Hester no particular ill will for her earlier refusal, stopping often at her gate on his way through the village to ask after the lavender and later, after Edward's latest repairs around the village, the two of them having settled into an easy, undemanding friendship that neither had quite anticipated on the afternoon he first proposed. The sailor who had once brought false hope of Edward's whereabouts passed through Hollow Bridge again, years later, on another leg of his travels, and stopped specifically at Hester's gate to apologize properly for the uncertain rumor he had once carried, clearly still troubled by the brief, false hope he had unknowingly delivered. Hester told him there was nothing to apologize for, that his uncertain news had been kinder than no news at all, and sent him on his way with a small bundle of dried lavender for his trouble, the same gift she had taken, by then, to offering nearly everyone who passed through her gate. The traveling photographer, on what turned out to be his final circuit through the countryside before retiring his heavy wooden camera for good, returned once more to Hollow Bridge and, to the surprise of nearly everyone who remembered her long-standing refusal, found Hester finally willing to sit for a portrait, with Edward standing beside her chair and Albert just behind them both. The small tin photograph that resulted hung, for the rest of Hester's life, on the wall above her kitchen table, the first and only image she ever allowed of herself, taken at last in a moment she no longer needed to refuse capturing. The village's young curate, eventually succeeding the elderly reverend after his quiet passing some years later, presided over more weddings and christenings in Hollow Bridge than perhaps any reverend before him, the village having entered, in the years following Edward's return, a particularly fertile stretch of new beginnings that the older villagers liked to half-jokingly credit to the general good fortune the lavender gardener's story seemed to have brought the whole community. The curate himself never quite encouraged this superstition, though he privately admitted to Hester once that he found it a far gentler explanation for good fortune than most of the alternatives. Mrs. Whitcomb's niece, taking over the bakery in her aunt's later years, continued the small tradition Mrs. Whitcomb had quietly begun, setting aside an extra loaf each week without ever quite remembering, or needing to remember, exactly why the custom had started in the first place. It simply became, over time, one of the bakery's many small unspoken rituals, the kind every long-standing village business eventually accumulates, its original purpose softened and folded gently into the ordinary fabric of habit. Albert Finch continued his postal rounds for nearly 15 more years after Edward's return, well past the point most men in his position would have considered retirement, finally stepping back from the work only when his knees simply refused the hills any longer. The village held a modest gathering in his honor when he finally retired, and it was Edward, fittingly, who stood to speak first, recounting for the assembled village the particular morning, so many years before, when Albert's hurried bicycle had carried news up that same lane that had changed two lives entirely, news that Albert himself had waited 23 patient years to finally deliver. The greenhouse itself, restored now to its original purpose of sheltering delicate things through difficult seasons, became over the years something of a quiet landmark in its own right, villagers occasionally pointing it out to visitors passing through Hollow Bridge as the place where, as the story was usually told by then, a woman had once kept a promise to her son inside walls of fogged glass for 23 patient years. Edward kept its panes clean and its old iron lock well-oiled long after any practical need for security remained, simply out of a quiet respect for what the small building had once held, and what it had eventually returned to them both. Hester's hands, in her later years, grew slower in the lavender rose than they had once been, the particular steadiness of her younger gardening years gradually softening into something more careful, more deliberate, though no less devoted. Edward took on more of the heavier work without ever making a show of it, simply falling into the rows beside her each morning and quietly managing whatever her hands could no longer easily manage themselves, the two of them maintaining, even as the balance of labor shifted between them, the same unhurried partnership they had built together in the months following his return. The lavender field itself grew, over the decades, considerably larger than it had ever been in Hester's most hopeful years of extra planting, Edward eventually extending the rows further along the lane than his father had ever originally laid them out, partly to meet the modest but steady demand the village market had developed for hollow bridge lavender, and partly, he admitted once to his mother, simply because he found he could not quite stop himself from planting more of it than was strictly necessary, a habit he seemed to have inherited as surely as he had inherited his father's careful hands. Visitors to Hollow Bridge, in the years after the story had properly settled into local legend, sometimes asked to see the famous greenhouse for themselves, and Hester, in her later years, took a quiet pleasure in showing it to anyone genuinely curious, walking them through the small wooden chest's original resting place and explaining, in her own plain and unhurried way, exactly what had been kept there and exactly how long it had waited. She never dressed the story up with more drama than it actually contained, finding that the simple, ordinary truth of a misplaced mail sack and 23 years of honest waiting needed no embellishment to hold a listener's full attention. The village's youngest generation, growing up entirely after Edward's return, knew Hollow Bridge only as a place where an old woman and her grown son tended a particularly fine lavender field together, the locked greenhouse and the years of silent waiting having faded, for them, into nothing more than a pleasant story told occasionally at gatherings, softened by time into something closer to a fable than a lived memory. Hester did not mind this softening in the slightest, recognizing it as the natural and proper fate of any story old enough to outlive the raw edges of its own original pain. Edward never did return to the sea, though he kept, for the rest of his life, a small collection of items from his years away, displayed without ceremony on a shelf in the cottage's front room. A coil of rope from his very first ship, a carved wooden bird Captain Holloway had given him as a parting gift, the half of a torn dollar bill he had kept in memory of Thomas Pruitt, the brother he had lost at sea. He told visitors, when they asked about these small relics, only that they reminded him of a life he had once needed to live before he could properly understand the value of the one waiting for him back home. On quiet evenings, long after the story had settled into its gentle legend, villagers passing the old stone bridge at dusk sometimes claimed they could catch, carried faintly on the evening air, the particular fragrance of lavender drifting down from the field at the edge of the village, even in seasons when the plants themselves had long since gone dormant for winter. Whether this was simple memory playing tricks on the senses, or something more genuinely lingering in the particular character of that one small corner of the English countryside, no one in Hollow Bridge ever much bothered to determine. It seemed, to most who lived there, a fitting enough mystery to leave gently unsolved, the way the best stories in small villages so often are. There was, in those later years, a particular evening every autumn when Hester and Edward would walk together to the old stone bridge after the harvest was finally finished. simply to stand a while at its center and look out over the lavender field in the fading light. A small private ritual neither of them ever spoke of to anyone else in the village. They rarely said much during these walks, content to let the quiet itself carry whatever needed carrying. The same comfortable silence that had grown between them in the months after his return having only deepened, over the years, into something neither of them could properly name but both relied upon equally. Albert, in his retirement, took up a habit of sitting most mornings on the same small porch where he had once cooled his tea after Edward's homecoming, watching the new postman, a cheerful young man he had personally trained, ride the very same lane up toward Hester's cottage that he himself had ridden for nearly 4 decades. He never once expressed envy at handing the round over, only a quiet satisfaction in knowing the lane would continue being ridden. The village would continue receiving its small daily share of news and silence and occasional miracles, regardless of whose legs happened to be doing the pedaling. The reverend who had first welcomed the new young curate to Hollow Bridge lived just long enough to see Edward and Hester's first anniversary gathering before passing peacefully in his sleep that same winter, and the curate, presiding over his own first funeral in his new role, found himself speaking, almost without planning to, about the particular grace of stories that take their time arriving at their proper endings, a theme he admitted afterward to Hester he had borrowed, without quite realizing it until the words were already spoken, from her own. Hester kept, until the end of her life, the original water-damaged letter that had started everything, the one with its unfinished sentence still faded but legible, tucked safely now inside the same small wooden chest that had once held Edward's unopened letters home. She told him once that she had considered, many times, finally writing the ending herself, filling in whatever words the water had stolen, but had decided, in the end, that some sentences were better left unfinished on the page precisely because life itself had gone on to finish them so thoroughly in every other way that actually mattered. In her final years, Hester took to spending her mornings simply sitting at the edge of the lavender field rather than working it directly, watching Edward and, eventually, his own children move through the rows with the same careful attention she had once given them herself. She found, in this gentler later season of her own life, that watching the lavender tended by hands other than her own brought a satisfaction every bit as deep as the planting itself once had. The particular pleasure of seeing a thing you have devoted a lifetime to continue thriving long after your own hands have grown too tired to carry it forward alone. The story of the lavender gardener of Hollow Bridge, told and retold across the years that followed, never lost the particular detail that seemed to matter most to whoever happened to be hearing it for the first time, that 23 years of silence had never once been a choice either of them made, only an honest mistake that time and a misplaced sack of mail had allowed to grow far larger than it ever deserved to become. It remained, long after both Hester and Edward had themselves become only memories carried by Hollow Bridge's newer generations. The kind of story a small village tells its children not to frighten them, but to gently remind them that even the longest, most uncertain waiting sometimes ends exactly the way the truest stories always do, quietly, faithfully, and at long last at rest. If there was anything Hollow Bridge learned, quietly and without ever needing to discuss it aloud, from the story of the lavender gardener and her son, it was that devotion rarely announces itself with certainty. Hester had not known, through any of those 23 years, whether her patient planting would ever be rewarded, whether the rose she tended each spring would bloom for a son who remembered them or simply fade, season after season, into nothing more than a private ritual of grief. She had kept going anyway, not because she was certain of an outcome, but because some forms of love simply insist on continuing, regardless of whether the world ever confirms they were right to. There is a particular kind of comfort the villagers of Hollow Bridge came to understand, in learning that even the longest silences are not always what they seem. 23 years had passed not because anyone had chosen distance over devotion, but because of something as ordinary and unremarkable as a misplaced sack of mail, forgotten in a storage room by people who never knew what they were costing two people who loved each other across all that empty time. It was, in its own quiet way, a reminder that the things we fear most about the people we love, the silences, the unanswered letters, the years without word, are not always the truths they appear to be from the outside. As summer settled fully over Hollow Bridge, the evenings grew longer and softer, the kind of evenings that seemed to stretch on gently before finally giving way to night. Hester and Edward fell into a rhythm that felt, to both of them, less like rebuilding something broken and more like simply continuing something that had never truly stopped, only paused, waiting patiently for the day it could resume. They tended the lavender together each morning, repaired what needed repairing, and shared their evenings at the same small kitchen table where an unfinished letter had once sat, now replaced by ordinary conversation and the comfortable silences of two people who no longer needed words to feel close to one another. The village itself settled, too, into its own peaceful rhythm as the season wore on. Lamps were lit each evening along the high street, one by one, their warm light spilling softly across cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of quiet footsteps. The bakery closed its shutters a little earlier now that the days had grown long enough to need no extra light. The chapel bell rang its evening hour with the same unhurried patience it always had, indifferent to whatever joys or sorrows had unfolded beneath it that particular day. And beneath the old stone bridge, freshly repaired and steady once more, the stream continued its quiet passage exactly as it always had, carrying nothing more urgent than the simple, patient rhythm of water finding its way home. On the evening this story finally comes to rest, Hester stood once more at the edge of her lavender field, much as she had on so many ordinary evenings before, watching the last gold light fade slowly into the deep blue of approaching night. Edward stood beside her now, where for 23 years there had been only silence and soil and the patient hope of an empty space waiting to be filled. Neither of them spoke. There was, by now, very little left that needed saying. The lavender swayed gently in the cooling evening air, the same rose that had bloomed faithfully every single year of that long, quiet wait, finally blooming now for someone who had come home to see them. 23 years. That is how long Hester Calloway knelt in this same patch of English soil, planting lavender for a son she never stopped believing would return. And as the last light faded over Hollow Bridge, and the lamps along the high street dimmed one by one into a soft and settled darkness, the only sound left in the village was the quiet rustle of lavender in the night breeze, patient still, faithful still, finally, gently at rest.